Hello. Today we're going to talk about Alice Walker and her story, Everyday Use, that we're going to be reading. This is just going to be just a brief overview. I encourage you to go out to Wikipedia and look at Alice Walker's page there. You'll be able to find out a lot of things, especially going into our comparison and contrast paper. This is a story with two sisters that are very similar and very different in a lot of ways. And this is one of those stories that you can start thinking about those issues. And just a few things to think about that might help you scare up topics. And the magic happens when you have good search terms or keywords, okay? So a little bit about Alice Walker. She's African American, born in the South, and grew up very, very poor in Georgia, rural Georgia, mainly during the Jim Crow era of the South, which we all know is a time when it's institutionalized in rampant racism. But through donations from her church and from her family members, they were able to scrape up enough together to get her to go to Sarah Lawrence College, which was a very expensive Ivy League all-girls university or college at the time, liberal arts school. So if that sounds a little bit like D, then you'd be correct, okay? Because she's got a lot of the same things in her past, okay? She went to Sarah Lawrence, but unlike Dee, she came back to the South to work during the Civil Rights Movement. And she got married. And I don't want to say she didn't love the guy. Okay, the guy that she married was in the 60s. Okay, now think about this. He was Jewish. He was white. He was a lawyer. And to make it all the worse for everything else, he was also from New York City, and they lived in the South and got married in the South. And I'm not saying she didn't love the guy, but she has been in a committed relationship with a folk singer, Tracy Chapman, for about the past 30 years. You know her from that "Give Me One Reason to Stay Here." You know that song. I'm not going to sing the rest of it, but anyway. But at the time in the 60s, she absolutely was not afraid of controversy and certainly racial justice. So if you are thinking about a racial or cultural lens for this story, ding, 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 you are correct. Okay, and absolutely, this is not something that she wants you to guess about. She absolutely is. This is low-hanging fruit if you're talking about looking at this through a racial or cultural lens. So anyway, she goes to college, comes back to the South, and she ends up being not only an activist, but a writer. And she's known primarily as a novelist. You would know her. The obvious one would be The Color Purple and Possessing the Secret of Joy are two of her more, I guess, I would say popular, but certainly more important works. Certainly The Color Purple ended up, Spielberg made a movie of it. Whoopi Goldberg got an Oscar. In fact, she's one of the few people that has an Emmy, an Oscar, a Grammy, and a Tony. Fun fact. At any rate, that's not important now. Alice Walker is known primarily as a novelist, but this is one of her more famous short stories. Okay. And we'll find out why it is in a few minutes. But these days she doesn't write as she's still alive. These days she doesn't write all that much anymore. She's kind of since Maya Angelou passed away, she's kind of this grande dame of letters. She's kind of famous for being Alice Walker now. So she goes around giving speeches and whatnot. So she's sort of this elder stateswoman now, and she deserves every bit of that, by the way. But at any rate, that's kind of her background. Okay, so she absolutely was. Oh, and one more fact: she was scarred. At a very young age, one of her relatives shot a BB gun at her, and I'm from the country too. I can't believe I have two eyes in my head because BB gun wars were anyway. She got hit in the eye with a BB gun, and so she was scarred. She was blind in one eye because of this accident, and so that sounds a little like Maggie. Well, then, ding, ding, ding. Okay, so. So there's a lot of questions here about this particular story in terms of Alice Walker. Now, I want to be clear about this. Do not look at this story as being autobiographical. I've told you this before. Don't make the mistake of thinking that these are all the personal stories from the author's past. All artists use their lives, use the world around them to create their art. In this case, yes, the background of some of these characters does inflect how she does these characters, but there's always a bigger picture going on besides just here's the story of my life. Okay, artists find art in their lives. Okay, and that and making the art out of their lives, it relates to your life. Okay, this goes back to the Sonny's Blues, where his brother said, when the artist when he triumphs. I'm paraphrasing, the audience triumphs also. Okay, so the same kind of thing when it comes to everyday use here. But okay, everyday use was published in the early 70s. If you're looking at this story, kind of looking at the given circumstances, it's set in the American South. And without knowing exactly when this takes place, we can assume that probably the early 70s would be the today of the story. And but it does talk about some things that happened in the past, and it is dedicated to your grandmama. So we'll talk about a little bit what that means in a little bit. Why do you think that she dedicated it to your grandmama and not just her grandmama? Okay, and themes that run through this are the ideas of family. And family, we've seen, you can hang a lot of themes on family: legacy, memory, the sins of the father, blood, history, generational conflict, all those kinds of things that are wrapped up in the idea of family are in this story, as they are in all the other stories that deal with family members. So the theme suggested by family is truth versus appearances, surface versus what the truth is. It takes place in the South, very poor, a very, very rural area. Okay, and our characters, Mama. She's big boned, got man hands. The thing is who she represents. She's very matter of fact. Okay, and you tell this the very first that little scene with her dream that she has. She's under no illusions about who she is. She's got man hands. She can kill a hog. She can skin a buck and run a trot line. She can survive. She's every bit. She's proud of that. She has no illusions about that. She doesn't wish she was something else. D, our Wangero, is almost exactly the opposite. Okay, she's selfish. She's pretty. She's light-skinned, which is very important if you look at this through a racial lens, because that the fact that she mentions this in the story makes it significant. And she's a little snooty, and she also the key thing to know about D is that she, and I believe the quote is, at 16, she had a style and knew what style was. Okay, the idea about style is very important to this particular story. And then you have Maggie, right? Maggie, who is homely. She's scarred. How was she scarred? There was this fire. Dee was standing under the tree, kind of watching the house burn. I've read the story enough there's nothing in the story to suggest that Dee set this fire, but it'd be interesting to know that if she did or not. She's meek and mild. In a lot of ways, she knows her place. Okay, if you think about, Battle Royal. Okay, the idea of knowing your place, certainly in the racial and class and cultural pecking order, Maggie would be that particular person who's very meek and doesn't really cause any kind of trouble, and she's real low key. To be contrasted, ding ding, with D. Okay, they're sort of very opposite, but there are some important similarities you could look at too. Then you got Hakima Barber, he only says one thing, and he kind of shows himself to not really to kind of be above manual labor. What does he say? Manual labor is not my style, or something like that. And so there's the idea about style. He's also Muslim. It mentions that he doesn't eat pork. He is probably Nation of Islam. We don't know for a fact, but during this time, historically, in the early 70s, there was a movement, which we'll talk about in a second, where that would have been completely in line with what was going on culturally, and certainly in racial politics at the time of the early 70s. Turning to any 70s television show from this era, anywhere between 1972 to 1975, Good Times, Sanford and Son, all the ones created by Norman Lear, there's always this undercurrent of this movement that's going on at the time during the black community, which is absolutely pertinent to this particular story. During this time, during the early 70s, there was this movement called the Afrikaner movement. Some people also called it the Back to Africa movement. It was just our Black Pride movement, where I guess probably the most famous examples of this would be where um, African American sports figures would get rid of their name, like they're saying in this story, which is, you got to cast off the name that's given to you by your slave owner and pick your own name, and it's got to be about Africa, the motherland. And so, probably the most famous example of this would be Cassius Clay, who famously became a Muslim and became Muhammad Ali, the greatest, and it wore his faith like a badge the rest of his life. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is another one. And so this was a thing going through. And if you tune into Sanford and Son during this time, it was even parodied on television. Like Lamont, Fred Sanford's son, the son of Sanford and Son, would always have a friend who would come over and he'd be wearing like a dashiki, and he'd be talking about how, Lamont, you have to get your heritage back. And it was a thing that was all over the place at this time. So it was fashionable, okay, in that it was to the point where it was even being parodied on television. So this sounds like, though, think about Alice Walker. She's a Black activist. She's all about history, all about heritage. Why would she paint two characters in this story? One of the main characters, another one, her sort of boyfriend here. Why would she paint them as so ridiculous or so over the top and selfish? If they are kind of doing the same thing that she would be interested in? That's a big question, okay? I guess the other big thing to talk about with the story would be the blanket in question, okay? The quilt or whatever, what have you. This is fraught with symbolism, okay? It is made by the grandmother, who was a genuine slave, okay, or at least the daughter of a slave, I believe. And so it's this artifact from the days of slavery. So the question is, here comes Dee. What are her motivations? There's a psychological, remember, what does Dee represent? Once you figure that out, you think about what that psychology of that character might be. That could give you some insight. Same thing with Maggie. Maggie represents something. She is going to do something with this blanket too. The question then remains, and again, like all great art, just asks questions that it doesn't give you answers to, and that's why we continue to read this story. Why does, or I guess who in this story honors the legacy of the grandmother the best, right? Is it Dee, who is going to put it on a wall and show it to all of her friends and community, which preserves the artifact so that subsequent generations can go, oh yeah, wow, and there's a tangible thing. So there is a place for museums, remembrance, those kinds of things. So you put that on the wall. But that's not why the grandmother made it, right? The grandmother made it to keep you warm. She wouldn't even understand. What do you mean putting it on a wall? That's crazy talk, okay? So the fact that Maggie was going to use it for what it was intended for, to be passed down and used, hence the name of the story. Alice Walker doesn't really make a case one way or the other. I guess you could say that by making Dee so unsympathetic that maybe she's tipping her hand towards Maggie. I don't know, okay? But certainly there's a lot to think about in this story when you look at the historical moment. If you look at, I encourage you to really look at that initial scene where she's talking about this dream she has about Johnny Carson and what she looks like, and this whole hypothetical dream that she sees, what that says about the characters, what that says about Mama. What is that really about? Is that about how we want the world to see us a certain way, and if they don't see us a certain way, we wish that they did? I mean, I don't know. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in the story, okay? So I encourage you, as you look at this, look at the life of Alice Walker. Think about the things we talked about, the themes, family, history. Is there a feminist angle to this? No men in this story. Well, the only one is really ridiculous, okay? So I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can go here. But certainly if you're thinking about comparison and contrast ideas, you got not only within this one story, Dee and Maggie, but you also have, here's a set of sisters, you got a set of brothers in Sonny's Blues. Yeah, so I put this stuff in there so you can kind of notice these things. So I'm hoping you pick up on this, okay? So at any rate, that is Everyday Use and Alice Walker, and I'll post a couple of these lecture notes. It's basically just a list of some facts and things like this. Almost everything you can find out on Wikipedia, but there are a couple other things that we talked about I want you to have notes about. So I'll post those on as well on D2L, and see you guys after a while.